My name is Emma Sullivan. I am 29 years old. For the past 3 years, every time I found a new job, only a few days later, I would be let go. The reason was never said directly, but eventually I learned why. My father called the places where I worked and told them that I had a criminal record. I do not. I have never been arrested. I have never been interrogated. I have never even stepped inside a police station. But when a man who claims to be your father calls a company and says that you have had trouble with the law, most managers do not want to take the risk. And so for the past 3 years, my jobs have disappeared again and again. Eventually, I lost my place to live as well. Now I am living in a shelter for women on the outskirts of Missouri. This building used to be a warehouse. They only renovated it roughly and placed a few rows of metal bunk beds inside. The hallway is long and narrow. The fluorescent lights on the ceiling shine with a cold white glow that makes everything look slightly pale. Mornings here begin very early. Some people wake up at 5 to go to the first shift at the supermarket. Some wake up just to stand in line for the shared bathroom. I usually wake up a little later. That morning was cold. Not the biting cold of winter, but enough for your breath to turn into mist when you exhale. I stood at the sink at the end of the hallway washing a cream-colored sweater. It was the sweater I wore to job interviews. I bought it at a thrift store for $4. One sleeve had already begun to pill, but if I wore a coat over it, it still looked fine. I gently rubbed the sweater in cold water, trying to clean the dried coffee stain on the cuff. Next to me, another woman was brushing her teeth. She looked about 50 years old, her hair tied up high, still wearing the uniform of a convenience store. She looked at me through the mirror. "Another interview?" she asked. I nodded. "Yeah." She spat toothpaste into the sink and said, "Hope this one works out." I gave a small smile but did not answer. I had heard that sentence many times. After finishing the washing, I wrung the sweater and hung it on a metal hook next to the window. Cold wind from outside blew in and made the sweater sway slightly. I took out my phone and checked it. A new message. "Sender, Dad." I stared at the screen for a few seconds before opening it. The message had only one line. "Come home. I will stop." I could almost hear his voice when I read those words. He had sent messages like this many times, never long, never any explanation, just an offer, or more accurately a condition. Come home. If I returned to the house on Maple Street in the town of Red Willow, those calls would probably stop. He would stop calling my workplaces. No warnings to managers. No telling them stories that were not true about my supposed legal problems. I locked the phone screen. I had not replied to any message in 3 years. "Emma." I turned around. Linda Marsh was standing at the end of the hallway. Linda was the manager of the shelter. She was about 45 years old, with short hair, always carrying a clipboard. She was not the gentle type, but she was fair. And in a place like this, that was already a lot. "Come to my office for a moment," Linda said. I wiped my hands on a towel. "What is it?" Linda shrugged. "Someone wants to see you." I paused for a moment. "See me?" In a place like this, when someone says someone wants to see you, it is rarely good news. It could be a social worker. It could be the police. It could even be someone from one of the companies where I had worked. I followed Linda down the hallway. Her office was just a small room with a wooden desk, a filing cabinet, and 2 chairs. The door was open. Linda stopped at the doorway and said, "She is waiting." I looked inside. A woman was sitting on the chair. She looked to be in her 50s. Gray hair cut neatly at the back of her neck. A dark blue coat. Low leather shoes. She sat very straight. On her lap was a brown leather briefcase. I stood at the door for a few seconds. "I do not think we know each other," I said. The woman looked up. Her eyes were calm, almost evaluating. "You are Emma Sullivan." "Not a question." I nodded. "Yes." She placed the briefcase on the desk and stood up. "My name is Martha Klein." She opened the case, took out a small card, and handed it to me. "I am a licensed private investigator in the state of Missouri." I looked at the card for a few seconds. A cold feeling ran down my spine. A private investigator. In my situation, that usually meant only one thing. My father. Maybe he had hired someone to find me. Maybe he wanted to know where I was. what I was doing, whether I would come back or not. I placed the card on the desk. I have nothing to say, I said. I think you do, Martha replied. Her voice was very calm. I do not work for your father. I frowned. Then who do you work for? Martha did not answer immediately. She turned the briefcase on the desk so the top faced me. The leather was old, the corners slightly worn, but the moment I saw it, my heart began to beat faster. I recognized that briefcase. It had sat on my grandmother's kitchen table many times. Martha said, Your grandmother hired me. I blinked. My grandmother is dead. Yes. 6 years ago. Yes. I looked at the leather case. A line of handwriting in black ink was written across the top. The ink had faded slightly with time, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. My grandmother's handwriting. The line said, For Emma, when she is ready. The room suddenly became very quiet. My throat felt dry. You said my grandmother hired you, I asked. Martha nodded. Yes. When? About 10 years ago. I looked at her. 10 years. She was worried about you. I let out a small laugh, but it sounded strange. Worried about me. Martha placed her hand on the briefcase. She believed that one day you might need help. I said nothing. In my mind, I saw my grandmother's house across town, the teapot always sitting on the stove, and the way she looked at me whenever my father began his long lectures about family. Martha unlocked the briefcase. A small metallic click sounded in the room. Emma, she said, before you decide to go back home, or keep living like this, you should know the truth about the past 3 years. Inside was a very thick file. You should know the truth about the past 3 years. I looked at the stack of documents inside the briefcase. What do you mean? Martha pulled out a bundle of papers and placed them on the desk. Your father has called many of your workplaces. I nodded slowly. Yes, I know. Martha shook her head. No. She pushed the papers toward me. You do not know everything. I looked at the first page. A call log. Date. Company name. Content. I read the first line. Caller. Thomas Sullivan. My hands suddenly felt cold. Martha said quietly. Emma, your father did not just call a few times. She paused for a second. He has been doing it for 3 years. I looked up at her, and for the first time in a long time I began to wonder. Maybe my story was not just a series of failures. Maybe someone had planned all of it. Before I was living in a shelter, before I had to wash clothes in a shared sink and count every coin in my wallet, I grew up in a place that from the outside looked like the perfect town, Red Willow, Missouri. A small town with fewer than 8,000 people. There was only one main road running through the center. On both sides were a few small shops, a pharmacy, a bakery, a diner that opened early in the morning, and a supermarket called Fresh Mart. If you stood in the Fresh Mart parking lot on an afternoon, you could see almost the entire town. The white-painted Baptist church at the end of the road, the red brick high school on the other side, and several small streets branching out like tree limbs. In places like that, people do not just know your name, they know who your parents are, what class you were in, what you did in 8th grade, and sometimes they know things you thought only your family knew. My family in Red Willow was considered a model family. My father, Thomas Sullivan, was someone many people in town respected. He was tall, broad-shouldered, spoke slowly, and rarely laughed loudly. When he shook someone's hand, his grip was always firm and strong. To the neighbors, he was the kind of man people trusted. At church every Sunday morning, he always sat in the second row. Not the first row. He did not like attention, but never in the back either. After the service, he stood outside, shaking hands with people. Good morning, Tom. Good morning. At the grocery store, he helped elderly people reach items on the high shelves. At town fundraisers, he always donated. If you asked anyone in Red Willow about the Sullivan family, they would almost all say the same thing. That is a good family. My mother, Elaine Sullivan, was the kind of woman people described as gentle. She baked for church fundraisers. She brought soup to neighbors when they were sick. She remembered the birthdays of almost every child on the street. When I was in high school, teachers often told me, Emma, your parents are very good people. I always nodded. And for many years I believed that too. Our house stood at the end of Maple Street, a cream-colored house with a wooden porch in front and a large maple tree in the yard. From the outside, the house looked like something you would see on postcards about small-town life, but photographs do not capture what it feels like to live inside. In the Sullivan house, everything had rules, not the kind written down and pinned on the wall. They simply existed. You could feel them in the air. Dinner always started at 6. If the clock touched 6 and you were not sitting at the table yet, my father would look at the clock and ask, "Where were you?" Phones had to be placed on the kitchen counter after 9 at night. Bedroom doors were never locked. If I went out, I had to say where I was going, who I was meeting, and what time I would return. If I came home a few minutes late, my father would look at the wall clock and ask one short question. Why? He did not need to raise his voice. He did not need to get angry. That single question was enough to make the kitchen fall silent. I started working when I was 15. My first job was clearing tables at a diner near the highway. The place opened at 6 in the morning and was always full of truck drivers and construction workers. After every shift, my hair smelled like frying oil, but I did not mind. I loved the feeling of receiving my first pay envelope. It was the first time I felt that I had something that belonged only to me. That feeling lasted only a few hours. That night, when I placed the envelope on the kitchen table, my mother looked at it and said, "Give it to me to keep." I was surprised. "Keep it? Yes. You are still young. You do not know how to manage money yet." My father was reading the newspaper at the end of the table. He folded it and said, "Your mother is right." I held the pay envelope in my hand. "But I earned this." My father looked at me for a few seconds. Not angry, just very calm. "This family takes care of everything for you," he said. "Contributing is normal." And so my pay envelope was placed into a joint account that my mother kept. In the years after that, every dollar I earned went into that account. I did not have a card. I did not see statements. If I wanted to buy something, I had to ask. At the time, I thought that was normal. Many families in Red Willow managed their children's money. Only later did I understand that there is a difference between helping and controlling. At school, I did well. Not a genius, but always near the top of my class. I liked reading. I liked the library. The school library was not large, but it was always quiet. There no one asked where I was going, who I was with, or what time I would return. There I could sit for hours reading about other places, other cities, other lives. When I was 17, the school counselor called me over after class. She placed a stack of brochures in front of me. "Emma," she said, "have you thought about applying for college scholarships?" I looked at the papers. On the cover was an image of a campus with large buildings and long rows of trees. I carried those brochures all the way home. In my mind, I began to imagine a dormitory, another city, a life outside the 3-mile radius around Maple Street. That night, I placed the brochures on the dinner table. "I want to apply for scholarships," I said. My father glanced at the papers. He pushed them aside. "No." I thought he did not understand, but I could get a scholarship. I would not need. "No," he repeated. The kitchen fell silent. My mother was washing dishes. She said softly, "Your father just wants you close to family." My father continued, "A daughter does not need to go that far away." "But I want to try." He looked straight at me. "You have a house. You have food. You have a family." He tilted his head slightly. "What else do you need?" That was the first time I felt something strange in my chest. Not exactly anger. Not exactly sadness. Just a feeling that something was not right. But at the time, I did not know what to call it. In Red Willow, many girls did not leave town either. They graduated from high school and worked at the supermarket, the bank, or local shops. Many married early. Their parents wanted them close. So I told myself that my family was only a little stricter. Just that. I did not know that there was a very big difference between care and control. In my family, there was only one person who sometimes said something different. My grandmother. Her name was Rose Whitmore. She lived on the other side of town in a small house near the edge of the woods. Her house always smelled of mint tea and freshly baked cookies. I often visited her after school. One afternoon, while I was sitting in her kitchen telling her about the college scholarship, She looked at me for a long time. "Do you really want to go?" she asked. I nodded. "I want to see the world outside." She smiled. "That is a good thing." I looked at her. "But Dad will not allow it." She was silent for a moment. Then she said something that I did not fully understand at the time. "Emma," she said gently, "some families do not know how to let their children grow up." I frowned. "What do you mean?" She did not answer directly. She simply poured more tea into my cup and said, "Just remember one thing. Your life is yours." At the time I thought she was only trying to comfort me. I did not know that years later those words would become the most important thing she had ever said to me. I left Red Willow on an early morning in September. It was still very early. Thin mist covered the fields behind the house, and the maple leaves in the front yard had begun turning a deep red. I did not take many things with me. One small suitcase, one backpack, and an envelope of cash my grandmother had given me 2 days earlier. Without her, I probably would never have left that town. 2 weeks before the semester began, I received an email saying I had been accepted into a community college in St. Louis with a partial scholarship. Not the full scholarship I once dreamed of, but enough to give me a reason to leave. When I printed the email and placed it on the kitchen table, my father read it and said only one word. "No." That was all. No argument. No explanation. He folded the paper, placed it back on the table, and returned to reading the newspaper. I stood there for a long time. Finally I said, "I am still going." My father looked up. His eyes were not angry. They were cold. A very calm kind of cold. "You think you can live on your own." "I will try." He leaned back in his chair. "You do not know what the world out there is like, Emma." I did not answer. I simply picked up the paper and walked upstairs. That was the first time in my life I truly went against him. 2 days later, my grandmother called me to her house. She made tea, placed a plate of cookies on the table, and pushed a small envelope toward me. "Take it." I opened it. Inside was money. Not a lot, but enough to pay for a few months of dorm rent. "I cannot give you more than that," she said. I looked at her. "You prepared this ahead of time." She smiled gently. "I knew one day you would want to leave." I held the envelope. "Dad will be very angry." "Yes," she said. Then she looked at me for a long moment. But sometimes people must choose between disappointing someone and living their own life. On the morning I left, my father did not come out to see me off. He was sitting in the living room when I pulled my suitcase toward the door. The television was on, but the volume was very low. My mother stood in the kitchen. She hugged me before I left. The hug was light and brief. "Remember to call home," she said. I nodded. My father did not look at me as I walked out the door. He only said one sentence while still watching the television screen. "Do not expect to come back when things are not the way you imagined." I paused for a second. Then I walked outside. Street. Louis felt like a completely different world to me back then. Traffic everywhere. Tall buildings. Strangers all around. During the first week, I felt almost overwhelmed. The dorm was small and noisy, but to me it felt like a door had just opened. For the first time in my life, I had a room I could lock. No one asked where I was going. No one checked my phone. No one looked at the clock when I came back late. I worked part-time at a bookstore near the campus. The job was not difficult. Shelving books, cleaning the counter, sometimes helping customers find titles. Every 2 weeks I received my pay. This time the pay envelope belonged to me. I opened a bank account. I bought a used bicycle. Life was not always easy, but for the first time I felt like I was standing on my own feet. I called home once a week. The calls were usually very short. My mother asked a few questions about school. "Are you eating well?" "Yes." "How are the classes?" "Pretty good." My father rarely spoke. If he was near the phone, he only asked, "When will you come home to visit?" I usually answered, "During the midterm break." Then there were a few seconds of silence. Then he would say, "Okay." 2 years passed faster than I expected. I finished my program at the community college with fairly good grades. My advisor suggested that I transfer to a larger university. But I decided to work for a while. I wanted to save money. I found an office job at a small logistics company. It was not a dream job, but it was stable. I moved out of the dorm and rented a small apartment in the south part of the city. The apartment had only one bedroom and a small living room, but when I placed the key in the lock for the first time, I felt a strange kind of pride. It was my home, not my parents' home. Mine. Everything started to change 3 years ago. I was 26 then. I had worked at the logistics company for almost a year. The job was pretty good. My boss, Mr. Randall, was an easygoing man. One Wednesday afternoon, he called me into his office. He closed the door and sat across from me. He looked a little uncomfortable. "Emma," he said, "there is something I need to ask." I nodded. "Yes." He looked down at the desk for a few seconds. "Someone called the company today." I did not think much of it. "A client." He shook his head. "No." He looked up. "He said he is your father." I froze. "My father?" Randall nodded. "He said you once had trouble with the law." I stared at him. "What?" "He said you were once investigated for financial fraud." My heart started beating fast. "That is not true." "I know," Randall said quickly. "I did not think so." I took a breath. "Did he say anything else?" Randall hesitated. "He said he was only calling to warn us because he did not want the company to be affected." The room was silent for a few seconds. I felt my ears growing hot. "Do you believe him?" Randall looked at me. "Emma, I have worked with you for almost a year." I nodded. "Then," he sighed. "But when calls like that happen, the company has to be careful." I understood. Even though he did not say it directly, I understood. 2 days later, they let me go. I thought it was just a misunderstanding. A strange thing that happened once, and that was all. I looked for another job. 2 weeks later, I was hired at a small accounting office. 3 days after I started working, the manager called me into his office. The first thing he said was, "Your father just called." That was the first time in my life I truly felt afraid of my father. When I lost my job the second time, I still believed it was just some kind of misunderstanding. But by the third time, I began to realize something was not normal. My third job was at a small shipping company near the port of St. Louis. The office had only 8 people. The atmosphere was relaxed. People talked to each other like friends. The manager was named Greg. Greg was about 40, always wearing a rolled-up shirt and drinking black coffee all day. During the interview, he looked at my resume and said, "You worked in logistics before." "Yes." "Then this job should not be too complicated for you." I nodded. I was hired the very next day. The first week went by very normally. I got used to the order management software, used to the way Greg handled difficult customers, and used to the habit of everyone gathering around the coffee machine every morning. On Monday morning of the second week, Greg called me into his office. When I walked in, he was not looking at the computer screen like usual. He was leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed. On the desk was a sheet of notes. "Emma," he said slowly, "your father just called." The sentence made my stomach drop. I stood still for a few seconds. "What did he say?" Greg looked at the paper. "He said you were investigated for financial fraud at your previous company." I felt my face getting hot. "That is not true." "I know," Greg said. "I told him that too." I let out a small breath. "So, everything is fine." Greg did not answer right away. He looked at me for a moment. "Emma, why is your father calling your workplace?" I opened my mouth, but there was no reasonable answer. I could not say because he wants to ruin my life. It sounded too absurd. In the end, I only said, "I do not know." Greg nodded slowly. He did not fire me that day, but 2 weeks later he called me into the office again. "Emma, I am sorry," he said, "but we do not want to get involved in family trouble." And just like that, my third job ended. After that, I decided to call my father. I sat in my small apartment staring at his phone number on the screen for a long time. We had not really spoken for almost 2 years. Finally, I pressed call. The phone rang 3 times. "Hello." His voice sounded exactly the same as before. Calm, slow. "Dad," I said. Silence for a second. "Emma." Just one word. No happiness. No surprise. Just recognition. I took a breath. "You called my workplace. Not a question." On the other end, I heard the sound of a chair moving slightly. "Yes," he admitted it very quickly. "Why?" He did not answer immediately. After a few seconds, he said, "I just wanted them to be careful." I gripped the phone tightly. "Careful about what? You are not ready for the world out there." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. "You made me lose 3 jobs. You will lose many more," he said. His voice was still calm, as if he were talking about the weather. "Until you understand." "Understand what? That you should come home." My apartment was silent. I stood in the middle of the living room looking out the window where the streetlights had just turned on. "You are destroying my life." "No," he said. "I am saving it." Anger rose in my chest. "You do not have the right to do that," he replied immediately. "I am your father." The words fell like a door slamming shut. Then he said something I will never forget. "You can keep resisting, or you can come home. When you come back, everything will stop." I did not go home. For many months after that, I kept trying to find work. At first, I thought if I simply did not list my previous company on my resume, it would be fine. But my father always seemed to know. A few days after I started any new job, the manager would call me into the office. The story was always the same. Someone called. "He said he is your father, he warned us." Some places fired me immediately. Some were more polite and said the company was not a good fit. After the 5th time, I began to panic every time the office phone rang. After the 7th time, I could barely sleep. I started avoiding office jobs, trying work as a waitress, sales clerk, anything that did not require complicated paperwork. But my father still found me. One afternoon, while I was working the evening shift at a small coffee shop, the manager stepped out from behind the counter. "Emma, there is a call for you." I picked up the phone. "Hello." My father's voice came through the line. "You are still trying." I hung up immediately. After almost a year like that, my savings slowly ran out. Rent in Street Louis is not cheap. First, I sold my bicycle. Then I sold a few things from my apartment. Eventually, I had to leave the apartment. I moved into a small room in the house of someone I knew. Then a few months later, I moved into the shelter where I am now. All of that ran through my mind as I stood in Linda's office looking at the stack of files Martha Klein had placed on the desk. 3 years, she said. I looked at the papers. There were many. Call logs, emails, notes. Martha flipped through a few pages. "Your father did not only call the places where you worked," she pointed to a list. "He also called the places where you applied for jobs." I looked at the list. Company names. Dates. Some places I had never even heard back from. "What did he say to them?" I asked. Martha answered directly. "That you were investigated for financial fraud, and that he was worried you would cause problems for the company." My hands trembled slightly. "How did you get all of this?" Martha closed the file. "Your grandmother." I looked up. "But she died 6 years ago." "Yes." Martha nodded. "But before she passed away, she left money and asked me to keep an eye on your situation." The room was silent. "Why?" I asked. Martha looked at me for a long time. "Because she believed that one day, your father would try to keep you by any means necessary." I looked down at the file. A thought slowly formed in my mind. "You said you were watching my situation." "Yes." "Then you knew all of this from the beginning?" Martha nodded. "Yes." I looked at her. A heavy question sat in my throat. "Then why did you not tell me earlier?" Martha let out a slow breath. "Because your grandmother gave one condition." "What condition?" She answered slowly. "Only when your life had truly been pushed to the limit would I be allowed to give you this." She opened the leather briefcase again. This time she took out a thick envelope. On the front was my grandmother's handwriting. "Emma, open only when you are ready to know the truth." I held the envelope for a long time without opening it. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. The upper corner had a small crease as if it had been picked up and put down many times. The handwriting was familiar. My grandmother always wrote slightly slanted to the right, the letters connected, neat and firm. I looked at those words and felt my throat tighten. "Emma, open only when you are ready to know the truth." "When did she write this?" I asked. Martha Klein leaned slightly back in her chair. "About a year before she passed away." "Did she know what would happen?" "Not everything," Martha said, "but she guessed the direction things were going." I still had not opened the envelope. In my mind I saw my grandmother's small kitchen, the teapot gently boiling on the stove, the light blue tablecloth, the afternoon sunlight through the window. She was always the only person in the family who made me feel seen, not like a child who had to obey, but like a person. I took a breath and opened the envelope. Inside were several handwritten pages. I took out the first one. Martha said nothing. She simply sat quietly and gave me space. I began to read. Dear Emma, if you are reading this letter, it means things have gone further than I hoped. Since you were very young, I noticed something you may never have realized. Your father cannot stand the idea of losing control. I stopped. Those words hit my chest like a blow. I continued reading. I do not say this to make you hate him. Thomas is not a bad man in the way people usually think. He believes he is doing the right thing. But some people believe love means holding on tightly, and when they are afraid of losing something, they will do anything to keep it. I swallowed. Old memories began to rise. My father, looking at the clock whenever I came home late. My father demanding to know where I was going and who I was meeting. My father saying the world outside was dangerous. I always thought it was just protection. I kept reading. I know you want to leave Red Willow. I also know Thomas will not accept that easily. Do you remember when you told me about the college scholarship? That evening after you left, Thomas came to my house. I lifted my head from the paper. Martha, did you know about this? I asked. Martha nodded slightly. Keep reading. I looked back down at the letter. Thomas told me you were having dangerous ideas. He said the outside world would ruin you. I asked, or are you just afraid Emma will not come back? That night Thomas did not answer my question, but his eyes said enough. I felt my heart beating faster. A cold sensation ran down my spine. I had never thought about it that way. For many years I always believed my father was simply too protective. I kept reading. Emma, I cannot change my son, but I can prepare you. That is why I hired Martha Klein, not to watch you, but to watch what Thomas does. I looked up at Martha. You were watching my father. Not every day, she said. Only when necessary. And you knew about the calls. Martha nodded. Almost all of them. I looked back at the letter. I hoped you would build your own life and never need these documents, but if one day you are reading this letter, it means Thomas has done what I feared, trying to destroy your life outside so that you would be forced to come back. I felt my eyes growing hot. The past years suddenly became clearer than ever. The failed interviews, the times I was called into the manager office, the suspicious looks. I always thought I had done something wrong. I continued reading the final part of the letter. Emma, you need to understand one thing. What is happening to you is not your failure. It is the result of a plan. Thomas believes that if you cannot live outside, you will come back. And when you come back, he will see it as proof that he was right. I placed the letter on the table. The room was very quiet. Linda had left the office at some point. Only Martha and I remained. Did my grandmother know everything? I asked. Not every detail, Martha said, but she understood her son. I looked at the stack of files. So, these things, they are evidence. Evidence of what? Martha answered very slowly. That your father deliberately sabotaged your ability to earn a living for years. I sat still. Part of me still could not fully believe it. But what good does that do? Martha tilted her head slightly. Emma, do you know that what he did violates the law? I looked at her. You mean defamation? Martha said. Interference with employment. The words sounded unfamiliar. I had never imagined the law having anything to do with my family. But he is my father, I said. Martha looked straight at me. That does not give him the right to destroy your life. I remained silent. A very old memory suddenly appeared in my mind. An afternoon in my grandmother's kitchen. She looked at me and said, Your life is yours. I looked at Martha. What else is in that briefcase? She opened it again. Inside, there were not only call logs. There were copies of emails, audio recordings, even written statements from several managers who had received calls from my father. Martha pushed a stack of papers toward me. These people are willing to testify if necessary. I flipped through several pages. One name made me stop. Greg, the manager at the shipping company. Next to his name was a note. willing to confirm the content of Thomas Sullivan call. I looked up. You spoke to them. About 8 months. I looked at her in complete surprise. 8 months. Martha nodded. I began gathering everything when your situation became worse. I leaned back in the chair. For the first time in 3 years, a new thought appeared in my mind. Not fear. Not despair. A question. If I use these things, I said slowly, what will happen? Martha looked at me for a moment. Then she answered. There is a way to make your father stop. She closed the briefcase. But it will completely change the relationship between the two of you. I looked at the stack of files on the table. 3 years of my life lay inside them. 3 years when I believed I was simply a failure. I looked up. What way? I asked. Martha answered calmly. We sue him. The idea of suing my father sounded like something that only happens in movies. When Martha Klein said those words, my first reaction was not agreement. It was silence. I looked at her for a long time, trying to understand whether she was serious. Sue, my father. Martha nodded. Yes. I shook my head immediately. No. The answer came out almost by instinct. In my mind, I saw Red Willow. The narrow main road. The white church. The familiar neighbors. If this happened, the entire town would know. And in that town, my father was not a bad man. He was someone people trusted. I was the daughter who left. If I sued him, the story in their eyes would be very simple. An ungrateful daughter suing her father. No, I repeated. Martha did not argue immediately. She simply sat quietly for a moment, and then asked, Emma, do you think he will stop on his own? I did not answer. Because I knew the answer. No. The past 3 years had already proven that. Martha continued, her voice very calm. I am not saying you must decide today. I only want you to understand that you are not powerless. I looked at the files. During the past 3 years, the feeling of helplessness had become familiar. I had grown used to being called into manager offices, used to packing my things into a cardboard box, used to starting over again. Part of me had accepted that this was my life. But now for the first time, someone was telling me that this was not something I had to endure. Is there another option? I asked. Martha nodded. Yes. I looked up. We can send him a legal notice first. What notice? Demand that he stop all acts of defamation and interference with your employment. I thought for a few seconds. And if he does not stop, then we go to court. That sounded more reasonable. At least it would give my father a chance. Or maybe give me a chance to believe he might stop. Okay, I said. Martha looked at me. Are you sure? I nodded. At least we should try. During the next 2 weeks, my life suddenly became very different. Martha introduced me to a lawyer in St. Louis named Daniel Harris. His office was on the 3rd floor of an old building near downtown. Not luxurious, but neat. Daniel Harris was about 40, wore glasses, and spoke quickly but clearly. After reading through the files, he leaned back in his chair. This case is quite serious. I sat across from him with my hands clasped together. Do you think we have a chance? Daniel nodded. Yes. He tapped the stack of papers. We have call logs, witnesses, and a pattern of behavior that lasted for years. He looked at me. This is not an impulsive call from a worried father. This is a systematic campaign. The word campaign made me shiver slightly. I had never thought of it that way before. But looking at the documents on the table, I could not deny it. Daniel continued. The first step is sending a cease and desist letter. He turned his computer screen toward me. On it was a draft of a legal letter. The letter listed my father's actions clearly, calling employers, providing false information, damaging my ability to earn a living. At the end of the letter was a sentence. If these actions continue, we will pursue all necessary legal measures. When I finished reading, my heart was beating fast. This was no longer just a family argument. It had become a real legal matter. We will send this letter by certified mail, Daniel said. He will receive it in a few days. I nodded. What happens after that? Then we wait and see what he does. 3 days later, my father received the letter. I knew because my phone rang that evening. His name appeared on the screen. I stared at it for a long time. For 3 years, every time he called, I felt fear. But this time, The feeling was different. I answered. Hello! My father's voice came immediately. Emma. Just one word. But this time I heard something I had never heard before. Anger. What are you doing? I took a breath. I just want you to stop. I received the letter from your lawyer. Yes. On the other end, I heard him walking across the room. Are you planning to sue me? I answered slowly. If necessary. Silence. A long, heavy silence. Then he spoke again, his voice lower. Emma, do you really think I am a bad man? The question made me pause. I did not know how to answer. Finally, I said, I think you are doing things that make it impossible for me to live my own life. He laughed softly, but it was not a happy laugh. Do you think the world out there cares about you? I did not answer. He continued. Do you think those people will protect you? I said. I only need you to stop ruining everything. Silence again. I gave you the chance to come home. I do not want that. Then you will face the consequences. I tightened my grip on the phone. Are you still going to keep calling? He did not answer directly. He only said, One day you will understand. Then he hung up. 2 weeks later, I applied for a new job. An office assistant position at a small shipping company. I did not tell them about my situation. I simply applied normally. 3 days later, they called me for an interview. Everything went very well. The manager said they would contact me soon. I left the building with a familiar feeling, a small, fragile hope. 2 days later, my phone rang. I thought it was the company, but when I answered, the person on the other end said, I am sorry, but we just received a very concerning call about you. My heart dropped. I closed my eyes. The caller was your father. When the call ended, I sat for a long time on the steps outside the shelter. Evening wind moved through the empty street. In my mind, there was only one thought. My father had received the warning. He knew the case might go to court. And he still continued. That night, I called Daniel Harris. I said only one sentence. I think we should start the lawsuit. The day I signed the documents to sue my father, the sky over St. Louis was gray. No rain, but the clouds were low and heavy, as if the whole city were holding its breath. I sat in Daniel Harris' office, looking at the papers in front of me. My name was at the top, Emma Sullivan, plaintiff, and a few lines below, Thomas Sullivan, defendant. Just seeing those two names next to each other made my hands tremble slightly. Daniel placed the pen on the table. Emma, before you sign, I need to ask one more time. I looked at him. You want to be sure? Yes. He spoke very directly. Once this is filed, everything will become public. Court records, testimony, documents, all of it could become public information. I understood what he meant. Red Willow, a small town where news spreads faster than wind. If this lawsuit began sooner or later, people there would know. They would know that I was suing my father. They would hear two versions of the story, and I knew very well which one most of them would believe. Daniel continued, Do you still want to do this? I looked down at the papers. In my mind, I saw the past 3 years, the cardboard boxes I used to clean out my desks, the manager offices where I had to hear the words, We are sorry, the nights lying on a bunk bed in the shelter wondering what I had done wrong. Those 3 years were not a misunderstanding, not bad luck. It was a plan. I picked up the pen. Yes, I said. Then I signed. The lawsuit was filed 3 days later. During the first week, almost nothing happened. I still lived at the shelter. I still walked to the bus stop every morning looking for temporary work. Emma, we just received a response from your father's lawyer. He has a lawyer. Yes. I was a little surprised, but then remembered that my father always prepared carefully for everything. What did he say? Daniel let out a small breath. He denies everything. I was not surprised. And he says he only called to express the concern of a father. I laughed softly. Not because it was funny, but because it was so familiar. My father always had a way of turning his actions into something reasonable, Daniel continued. But they have a problem. Our evidence. Yes. He tapped the desk lightly. We have call logs, witnesses, and a pattern of behavior over several years. He paused for a moment. Honestly, if this case goes to court, they are not in a good position. 2 weeks later, we entered the deposition phase. One of the first people called was Greg, my former manager at the shipping company. We met in a small conference room at the law office. Greg looked a little tense. He rotated his coffee cup in his hands when he sat down. "Emma," he said, "I am sorry about what happened before." I shook my head. "You do not need to apologize." He sighed. "I should have trusted you more." I said nothing. Part of me still remembered the feeling of standing in his office that day. But I also knew he was not the one who caused this. Greg looked at Daniel. "What do you need me to say?" Daniel turned on the recorder. "Just describe exactly what happened." Greg nodded. He began describing the call from my father, how my father introduced himself, how he said I had been investigated for fraud, how he warned the company to be careful. Greg spoke clearly, without hesitation. When the deposition ended, Daniel turned off the recorder. He looked at me. "That is a very strong witness." A week later, Martha called me. "Emma," she said, "there is something you should know." "What?" Red Willow knows. I stood still for a moment. How? News travels fast in small towns. I could almost imagine it. Someone saw the court record. Someone told someone else. And soon the entire town started talking. I asked, "What are people saying?" Martha was silent for a moment. "There are two groups." "What groups?" "Some say you are doing the right thing. And some say you are destroying your family." I let out a slow breath. Not surprising. That was exactly what I expected. 3 days later, my phone rang close to midnight. My father's name appeared on the screen. I stared at it for a long time. Finally, I answered. "Emma." His voice sounded deeper and more tired than before. "You are making the whole town talk." I leaned against the wall. "You can stop any time." He did not answer immediately. Then he said, "Do you really want to take this to court? I want you to stop destroying my life." He laughed softly. "Do you think the court will understand our family?" I spoke slowly. "This is no longer a family matter." On the other end, I heard him breathe. "Emma, if you continue, you will not be able to come back." I closed my eyes. 3 years ago, those words might have frightened me. Not anymore. I left home a long time ago. Silence. A long silence. Then he said very quietly, "Your grandmother did this, did not she?" I opened my eyes. Finally, he said, "You do not understand," I asked. "Understand what?" He answered in a very low voice. "I did all of this because I did not want to lose you." For the first time in many years, I heard something real in his voice. Not control, not anger, but fear. Yet that fear had already destroyed too many things. "You lost me when you started destroying my life," I said. On the other end of the line, my father said nothing more. The call ended in silence. The next morning, Daniel called me. His voice sounded different. "Emma, we just heard from your father's lawyer." My heart started beating faster. "What did they say?" "He wants to meet privately." I looked out the window. The morning sky was pale, as if a new day was beginning very slowly. "For what?" I asked. Daniel answered. "He said he wants to end this before it goes any further." I met my father on a Tuesday afternoon. The place was a small diner outside St. Louis, about 20 minutes from the shelter. Daniel advised me not to meet alone, so we agreed he would sit at a table across the room. The diner was almost empty. Only a few people were finishing a late lunch, and a worker was wiping the counter. I arrived 10 minutes early. I chose a table near the window. My hands rested around a cup of coffee that had already grown cold. When the door opened, I knew immediately it was my father, even before I clearly saw his face. He still walked the same way, steady and slow, as if nothing around him ever rushed him. But as he came closer, I noticed something. He looked much older than the last time I had seen him. His hair was almost completely gray. The lines around his eyes were deeper. His shoulders were still broad, but they were no longer as straight as before. He sat down across from me. For a few seconds, we only looked at each other. No one spoke. Finally, he was the first to talk. "You look thinner." I almost laughed. 3 years of destroying my life, and the first thing he said was about my weight. "Why did you ask me to come?" I said. He placed both hands on the table. "I want this to stop." I nodded slightly. "So do I." He looked at me for a long time. His eyes were no longer as cold as before, but they were not the eyes of someone defeated either. They looked like the eyes of a man who had just realized he had gone too far. Your lawyer said if this goes to court, I will be in serious trouble. I did not answer. I spoke with my lawyer, he continued. He said the same thing. He breathed out slowly. Emma, I did not think things would go this far. I looked straight at him. You called dozens of my workplaces. He did not deny it. I just wanted you to come home. By destroying my life. He remained silent. After a moment, he said, I thought if you could not live out there, you would understand that family is the safe place. I leaned back in my chair. The sentence sounded painfully familiar, because in his mind it still made sense. Why can you not accept that I want to live my own life? I asked. He looked down at the table. For the first time in my life, my father did not have an immediate answer. After a moment, he spoke slowly. Because when you left, I felt like I had failed. The words made me freeze. I had never heard him say anything like that before. He continued, I spent my whole life building that family, that house, that life. He looked at me. And you left as if it meant nothing. Then I understood. Not completely, but enough to see part of the truth. My father was not only afraid of losing me, he was afraid that my leaving meant the life he built was not good enough. But that fear had destroyed 3 years of my life. You did not lose me when I left Red Willow, I said quietly. He looked up. You lost me because of what you did afterward. The sentence hung between us for a long time. Finally, he nodded, very slowly. Your lawyer said if I sign the agreement, you will withdraw the lawsuit. I nodded. The agreement was simple. My father had to officially acknowledge that the information he had given before was false. Send correction letters to the companies he had called. Promise never to contact my employers again. And if he violated it, the lawsuit would immediately resume. He looked at the paper in front of him. Then he signed. It took only a few seconds. 3 years of my life ended in a few seconds of ink on paper. On my first day, I still felt a little nervous whenever the office phone rang. But there were no calls. No warnings. No one saying my father had contacted them. Just normal work. And a strange feeling that my life finally belonged to me. I still have not gone back to Red Willow. Maybe one day I will. Maybe I will drive past the cream-colored house on Maple Street and look at the maple tree in the yard and remember part of my childhood. But if that day comes, I will return as a free person. Not someone who was dragged back. One afternoon, a few weeks after I started my new job, Martha Klein called me. Emma, do you know what today is? No, it is your grandmother's birthday. I smiled. She is probably drinking tea somewhere and watching us. Martha laughed softly. She would be very proud of you. I looked out the office window. The sky was clear. For the first time in a long time, I was not afraid of tomorrow. And I thought about something my grandmother once said. Your life is yours. Now I finally understand what it means. If you have read this far, you may have asked yourself the same question I once asked. What would you do if your own family stood in the way of your life? Would you endure it? Would you leave? Or would you stand up and fight like Emma? Everyone will have a different answer. If this story made you think, share your thoughts in the comments. I would love to know what you would do in that situation. And if you enjoy real emotional stories like this, support it with a like and follow so you will not miss the next ones. Sometimes just one story is enough to make us see our own lives differently.